Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for sticking around after Shorts Package Dartmouth for a panel discussion and a Q&A and sort of a casual conversation with a number of the filmmakers of the films that you just saw. So I am going to bring the filmmakers up to our virtual stage. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hello, hello. Hi. How's everyone doing?
Great.
Doing fine.
Great.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for being here. It's so nice to see your faces virtually. Of course, I wish that we could be on a small stage in front of a big screen in a movie theater, but we are here, and we'll just harness the energy of the Somerville Theater within our hearts and souls as we have this discussion. So to get us started, your names are obviously there in the films that you're associated with, but I'd love to go around and just have you guys introduce yourselves and say how, in what capacity you worked on the film that you're involved with. And why don't we start with In My View? So, Taryn, you want to kick us off?
Hi, I'm Taryn Reneau, and I was the director of In My View, Perspectives of a Surveillance Society. And this is my executive producer, Gerry Blight. Gerry, feel free to take it away.
Sure. Yeah, it's really neat to be involved in this. This movie started with an idea and a conversation that Taryn and I had, and I was thinking before we started that it became real to us when I was taking her to the airport in Chicago one time, very early in the morning before sunup, and no one was on the streets, and I must have rolled through a yellow light, or at least that's what I will claim, that it was yellow. And all of a sudden, we're talking about a surveillance society, and the night became day in a tremendous flash. And we realized that we'd been photographed by a camera in the dark, and we were interrupted in a conversation about surveillance. So it really made the whole thing crystallize for me, at least at that time.
Sure.
So thanks for having us.
Wow. Thanks for being here, guys. And then I'm just going to go around the circle for how you appear on my screen. How about Mike? We'd love to hear from you and how you were involved in your film.
Yeah, I'm Mike Attie from Abortion Helpline. This is Lisa, and I'm one of the co-directors along with Barbara Attie and Janet Goldwater. And I also shot the film as well.
Great, thank you. And Cara.
Hi, I'm Cara Feinberg. I'm the director and editor of LOCKSHOP, about a 2-room lock shop in South Boston that's been there for 100 years.
Almost exactly, right? Almost 100 years.
Almost exactly. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's right. Wow, awesome. Thank you guys so much. So I have some questions that I have prepared, but again, I feel like we can just have a conversation and just sort of, I don't know if you guys have questions for each other. We can just sort of have that dialogue. The first question that I always like to ask, though, and it's a little bit of a softball, but I always find the answer so interesting, is what brought you to the material? And Gerry, you sort of talked a little bit about what some of your inspiration for making this film, and sounds pretty direct, but if you want to elaborate that on that, or for the others of you, how did you come to this material or your subjects?
Well, if I could just start briefly, if that's okay. The idea came about, the surveillance society has been something that has been emerging in the United States for a period of time, accelerated greatly 20 years ago with the 9/11 event. But it didn't start there. It did accelerate beyond what the states were doing in other places. And in a conversation with Taryn at one point, she took it and ran with it and started investigating some of those other places. And that's really what became this film. So,
And I had read, that was interesting. I had read an article that suggested that citizens in the UK had access to their surveillance footage, and I just thought that was fascinating, and I started digging into that, and it was true. And obviously was compelling enough for us to go to London and learn more about that. And I just felt absolutely amazed that, when America, and Mrs. France talks about that in the film, that America is this bastion of rights, and that the UK didn't know what FOIA was when they first heard about it, but that they would have a right that we don't have, just was absolutely fascinating to me, and begged digging into it further. And I wanted to help provoke discussion in the States about how do we feel about that, and do we like that? Do we not like that? What do we want to do about that? And just begin a conversation on that subject and related subjects.
My film was just walking down the street in South Boston. I was there doing work for another film, actually. And I was with a friend who lived in South Boston, and we walked past Patty's shop, and it was an anomaly sticking out in a pretty gentrified part of Boston. It looked like South Boston looked in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, but not in the new millennium. Boston is a city of neighborhoods, and they're still a city of neighborhoods, but they are rapidly changing with gentrification. And so I went in to meet Patty, and I just really liked her. And so they're just walking into the shop that seemed already like something in some place I really wanted to know more about.
Cool. So the story for this film is so working with Barbara and Janet. So Barbara is my mother, and she's a filmmaker as well. And this is actually this is the first time we worked together, which is sort of interesting. Was an interesting experience for me. They had Barbara and Janet have had a long career of working on films about reproductive rights, and I think they were particularly motivated by the 2016 election and seeing that there was this concerted effort on the part of the Republican Party to pull back on reproductive rights. And they'd already had this relationship with the Women's Medical Fund. Janet, I believe, used to volunteer there or work with them in some capacity. And so it just became a matter of figuring out kind of the best creative approach and getting their permission to make the film. But yeah, they have Janet and Barbara have a really long history of this. They've made probably films. The first film they did about reproductive rights was when I was 12 years old, so quite a while ago. Wow.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I think one of the things that always sort of strikes me, and Taryn, you sort of touched on it a little bit, is so the shorts packages for IFF tend to, they usually have a thematic thread through them. And in this one, I felt like it was very much about America, the culture that we live in, and through obviously a number of different lenses, whether it's obviously very direct when it comes to, reproductive rights, whether it's a little less direct when it comes to the gentrification, or then really, I thought it was interesting, in my view was interesting because it was looking at it from that film was not film, we're talking about the UK and London, but it was such a reflection of the rights that we have in this country. And I guess I'm always curious about the filmmakers' reactions to sort of how their film fits into that thematic thread, and what their thoughts are about what you think your film, what you hope people take away from your film within the lens of sort of our country or the rights that we have. Yeah, Cara, I saw your hand raised.
I pulled rank from.
No, that's fine.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Well, I think mine will actually be pretty short, which is I'm really pleased to be in this block. That's why I raised my hand right away, because each of your films really highlights a political issue of some sort. I mean, I loved your films. And some of the filmmakers who aren't even here, elevator pitch, and what that means, not just for disabled people, say Americans in this case, but disabled people, but people with strollers and people pushing carts. And I'm looking at the list of shows here: The Great Fair, Abortion, Surveillance, Welcome Strangers. All of you guys have honed in on a particular issue and told stories within that issue. And I'm so pleased to be part of this package because my film tells a story and you have to spin out from that story the bigger political issue. And it's never addressed in my film directly, but it's the story of a small little shop and a family that's run it for a century in a neighborhood that is never going back to what it was, for better or for worse. There's a lot of for better, and there's a lot of for worse, and it depends what perspective you're coming from. South Boston has a pretty storied history and has gotten a lot of negative attention for being a place that was not particularly diverse. It was a lot of Irish American immigrants, Italian American immigrants, and now it's a lot of immigrants and gentrified. It's a great place to live. Like, people are putting in as much money as they can. It's a very different place. It's not a neighborhood where everybody knew everyone and where you know, if you did something down the block, your mom would know about it by the time you came home. And so for me, being able to for you to have seen that this is a film about an issue and not just one family in one shop is exactly what I was hoping.
Yep.
If I could just comment on that, Cara, I really appreciate your commentary there. I would probably broaden it just slightly in, I don't know that surveillance falls into a political issue as much as it is a social issue, because this is not a party line thing. This is a society. And we honed in on UK because I think the statistic at the time was the typical British citizen was on camera 360 times a day if they were in the city. And they had over 3 million cameras in the municipality at that time. And that's not one party versus the other. It's not like another party comes into power and they take all the cameras down. It's just evolving. And in the States, under both administrations, both parties rather, the surveillance has proliferated. So I just, I think we try to draw politics into a lot of things lately, but I want to not miss that social trend because it's really, and it's accelerating with the digital age too. So anyhow, it's not a correction. It's an endorsement of what you said.
Yeah.
In terms of the impact, I just want people to sort of be fascinated as I was, I guess. Maybe not as fascinated. They don't have to go make a short film of their own. But I just think there are certain things that fall from the idea of surveillance that have not yet been addressed in the US, certainly, and one could argue in other countries, but just in terms of our block being about America, Americana, and different related issues. I look forward to having those conversations with other people, be it online, since we're not in person, for example, right now, but all these things are being recorded of not just the 5 of us, but of millions of people in the country. And where are those things being stored? Are they being stored? For how long? There are so many things for which we don't yet have laws in our country. I just find that all very fascinating. And I guess in terms of impact, I would just like people to think about how they feel about surveillance individually and what are its pros and what are its cons and what is a violation of the Fourth Amendment and what isn't, and what are you okay with? I think just people taking a couple seconds or a whole minute or maybe even a discussion with a friend about what you think. Like, I'm just interested about what everyone else thinks, because I know what I'm thinking and how it has evolved for me the more I've learned, and it's still evolving. But I think it's an important issue for us to, as a society, decide what we want to do going forward, given what Gerry said about the proliferation of technology being what it is, and laws have yet to catch up. And so what laws do we want to put in place down the road, and what do we believe in for these things? Where do we need surveillance, and where maybe don't we? And in what society do we want to live? And I think that contributes back to this block. I mean, there are so many different aspects. When I was watching the one about the fair, it was just like, oh, wow, I've never been to a fair like that. I mean, maybe when I was a kid, but it was just, there were so many different facets of this block that were fun to sort of consume. And elevator pitch, I agree with you, Cara. It was just really compelling I mean, they were all very compelling. I couldn't be prouder to be part of this block, I have to say.
I guess just to add on that, for me, it was interesting to come into this film because obviously I was aware of the encroachment upon reproductive rights, but I didn't know a lot about the specifics of the Hyde Amendment. And so in some ways, my sort of ignorance made it a really telling experience for me. And maybe it's similar to what some of the audience experiences in that I didn't really understand the way in which reproductive rights are very much of like an economic issue, and the way that these policies are very much of like a classist and racist policy. What you're seeing, what you're hearing when you hear Henry Hyde speak, my blood curdles when I hear that. And I think I'm hoping that when people watch the film, remember, we didn't, I mean, honestly, when we made this at first, we didn't even intend it to be, it was thought to be very much like an advocacy piece. The festival component was sort of an afterthought, and ended up having like a pretty significant life in that realm. But I remember seeing it with an audience for the first time, and when Henry Hyde comes on the screen and after he says that line, there was this hiss from the audience, and it's like, oh wow, this is really something. People are really getting something out of this. And I also think the other thing I would hope people take out of it too is just what poverty really feels like in a very sort of concrete way when you start hearing the operators talk about those numbers, and you hear that, I mean, the people on the phone line talk about those numbers, and you start seeing actually the calculations of what people are having to do when it's coming down to like $25, $50. It's amazing how I don't think I perceive that kind of money as being so vital. This is going to make a difference in my life for the next month. This is in essence like a life-changing decision. It boils down to these very, very small amounts of money. And what's been so fascinating is that, like, every time the film screens somewhere, the organization that's connected to it sees this like blip in donations, because everyone feels this sudden like desire to just. I felt like I was sitting there shooting the film, like I could reach into my wallet and pull out money and solve this right now, and yet it's overwhelming because you're noticing this is happening every day for weeks. So I think obviously you want to sort of affect. In a film like this, especially, like, you want to affect change and bring awareness, but I think also just hopefully broaden people's thinking about how these issues around class and reproductive rights are connected.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too, Gerry, when you were talking about how we're not talking about political issues, but we're talking about social issues. I mean, abortion rights are such a political issue, quote unquote, but when you see your film, you see it's actually like we shouldn't be. The political side of it is so secondary to just the human side of like what these people are going through. And I don't know.
If anything, like, the irony is how disconnected those people are in DC from the people who are experiencing this, which I think it probably speaks to a lot of different, issues that they address. But, it just feels like such an utter disconnect. And that was, I think, what we were hoping for in the edit, was to create that really strong juxtaposition.
I think that's the strongest part of your film. That's not true. There's lots of strong parts of your film, but that contrast of what they were saying versus what was actually happening, it was beautifully done.
Yeah. I think all of these also, it must have been challenging to face some of these subjects, for all three of these films, and certainly if we had other filmmakers, all of these were difficult to think about. What were some of the more challenging parts of making these for you guys? What were you, whether it was emotionally, or whether it was even just in the filmmaking process? What were some challenges that you guys had to overcome?
I can talk about that, but the first thing that actually jumps into my mind is elevator pitch, because I just saw it, and the way I have to just shout this out, the way that it was shot with the locked down camera was so effective. And that camera, I didn't perceive it moving at all. Mm-mm. And I thought that was so effective when a handicapped man in a wheelchair is pulling himself up.
Yep.
ultimately 2 flights, at least 1 flight of stairs. And for the camera to just sit there and be like, we're going to sit and watch this. Everybody,
Yeah.
we're going to sit and watch what happens. I mean, just to comment on someone else's film, of which I was not a part, but as an audience member, I thought that was very effective. And it must be challenging to just stand there behind the camera and watch certain things happen, kind of like you were saying, Mike, you know, but it's just like, you know, you can affect change. And that cinematographer for Elevator Pitch just stood there behind the camera for the betterment of those of us who watch the film, you know.
Yes.
It's for all of us to take that in. And ultimately, I think that was probably most helpful for the man helping himself up the stairs, you know, to make that kind of impact on the rest of us. That's the first thing that leaps to my mind.
Yeah. There was a shot in that film where a man with a cane was slowly going up these stairs, and as he was getting towards the top, you could tell he was getting very tired, and his feet were just barely clearing like the steps towards the top. And it was so tense. I was so terrified he was going to fall. Like it was honestly like one of the more tense moments I can remember watching something in a while, because it was so. And to just be behind the camera, I was taking notes on these so that I could remind myself of like what I might want to ask. I think I just wrote in all caps, "This is brutal." Like watching this is so hard. So I know they're not here, but that to comment on that. But I completely agree. I see that like that must have been very difficult for those filmmakers. But yeah. How about for the rest of you? Any other thoughts about challenges?
I mean, for us, we had. Sorry, I'm hearing an echo, but we had this issue. When we initially started shooting the film, we had this idea that we weren't going to actually hear the callers on the other end. You would just hear the operators and then see the screens and have to triangulate what the person's going through based on the numbers that you would see. But I remember the first time shooting and even just catching like a tiny bit of that audio and on the mic, it was like so apparent that it had to be there and that was so important to the film. So we worked with a lawyer and crafted a statement that the operators, the hotline operators would read at the beginning of each call. And it's interesting, I'd say about maybe like 2/3 agreed. So, you know, as long as we obviously weren't going to disclose any personal information. But once you're filming, I mean, you know, there's this really uneasy place that we kind of alluded to earlier that you occupy with documentary where it's awkward to bear witness to this stuff. And I think if it wasn't awkward, you wouldn't be a human. If you didn't feel uncomfortable with it, you wouldn't be an empathetic human being. And I'd have never really like felt like I don't have a good way to resolve that question, an uneasiness about whether or not I should be there. I think now in retrospect, I feel good about it because I see all the positive impact that the film is having, but there's always this sense or this little bit of doubt that you have as a filmmaker about, you know, is this the right place to be? Is this really where the camera should be? So I think that to me was the challenge. I mean, certainly everyone's edits are always like that's a whole other conversation, but yeah, I think in the moment of filming, that was certainly it.
I think that's what makes documentaries. I mean, that's what makes documentaries good, because it's always highlighting something that no one would see otherwise, or that everyone sees and nobody sees like you do. And I would say that was definitely the hardest part of my film, for the same reasons of whenever you get to something that really means something, you worry like, am I going to upset this person? Am I going to disturb something that doesn't want to be disturbed? But for me, the hardest part was actually a filmmaking challenge, which was Patty, who's the locksmith in my film, is hilarious. And she was brutally hilarious with her customers, but she was very careful while we were on camera. We were getting to know each other while she was on camera to not put anybody in the terrible position of getting made fun of. And she was hilarious whenever we'd turn the camera away. And actually that's how I ended up in my own film, which was not part of the plan. But she'd said this amazing line about, well, you can tell a lot about people by their keys. And she hadn't shown it to me. So I was like, all right, Patty. And I'm like wearing my sunglasses and my coat. Like I'm getting ready to go. I'm holding a lens. Like, just what did my keys say about me? And then we saw the real Patty that I'd been seeing through all filming, and like she had no problem being brutally honest with me, and ripping my keys apart literally.
Yeah.
Which to me was so important, because to care about Patty and what she's going through and what the neighborhood's going through and what all of this means, you've got to see what you get at a small shop when you really know a person that you won't get elsewhere. And we can see that through all of the interactions that are in the film, but she is hilarious. And that was that moment.
Yeah.
We didn't really have too many, tense moments like that. But yeah, we had the apprehension essentially arriving in London, and we had no idea what the rank and file people on the street would think about the contrast between their rights and American rights. But we were pleasantly surprised on a couple of points. One was they were happy to talk with Americans. They were happy to talk with Americans about Great Britain. They were also pleased to find out that they had a rights advantage, if you will, over the American system. And that was kind of interesting to see. And they were just lovely people. But I thought it was a telltale sign when we arrived in country, because we noticed, we were doing some research on another program as well. So we looked up the London Library, and it turned out that the exhibit we were looking to see was on loan to an American city at that time. But we did find out that at that time we were there to film, they were hosting the 50th anniversary of George Orwell's publication of 1984. And it fits so naturally in with what we were talking about that it was just like, that's an omen, if you want to interpret it that way. But I felt very good about the fact that we're supposed to be here, and we were supposed to be here now. So,
yeah. I think we have time. We probably have a few minutes left to sort of flip that question. What were some of your favorite moments filming, or even the films that were, I don't want to say heavier, but some of these were really difficult, but what were some moments that gave you some joy while you were filming?
I can speak to that. Going to shoot in London, and I don't think I'd ever been to London. I wanted to shoot with natural light, and so it was as simple as waking up and checking that it wasn't raining, first of all, and then getting this great room with a fabulous bunch of natural light on Mrs. France was fantastic for me, because I was shooting it as well. And just when everything comes together, the sound guy who I had never met, Ian, is, shows up on time and does a great job. Sometimes it's the little things to that degree, but then also, Mrs. France was a dream interviewee, because I think that interview was at least 45 minutes, and I wanted to keep so much of it in. And there's so many more things that she said that I find fascinating, but I'm like, you got to temper this for the audience. Like, you just can't include everything that's amazing that you happen to get. So, but yeah, I think when things work out, and to send some kudos Gerry's way about finding the people on the street to interview. I think I was partially involved with picking Ian, but with Keith and Yasmin, that was Gerry. So thank you for that. And picking them out, because we didn't know any of them when we went in. We literally met them on the street. We're like, hey, we're doing this thing. Are you interested? And it worked out so well. And they were all so different with what they had to say, that even if you were planning it, I don't know that you would have pulled those 3 different pieces of life experience, though they work so well ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. How about the other 2?
It's hard to describe those terms when you're thinking about shooting a film like this, but I will say that certainly a couple things. I mean, the editing of the film, I think once you feel that suddenly it's starting to work in a really concise way, that's a really satisfying experience. And I remember that was something that I really enjoyed. It's been really great just to see the reaction to the film and the life that it's having. It's actually it's on this very full schedule in terms of a lot of screenings that pertain to helping abortion funds raise money, and then ideally bringing this conversation about the Hyde Amendment, you know, to the national level. And then finally, this is like, you know, the first chance I had to actually like work with my mother as a filmmaker, and that was fun and interesting. And I guess in the spirit of Mother's Day, I should like thank her and acknowledge her. But yeah, that was really great. You know, we've both been making films for a while, and it's really great to have someone in your family who's also a filmmaker, because you can sort of, they understand your triumphs and your challenges in a way that I don't think normal people do. So to finally, after all this time, and she claims this is her last film, we'll see, to finally work together was really wonderful.
I'm glad that I went right after you, Mike, because I feel like there was favorite moments in the shoot and then favorite moments in the edit. And I feel like my favorite overall moment is in the edit, and in discovering that the film that I went in to make was not the film that I wanted to make, that I had. And I went in to film, you know, I thought locksmithing itself was interesting, and I just wanted to know what she did and the mechanics of it. And I was interested in what actually a locksmith does. And it turns out you don't learn very much about locksmithing in my movie at all. It's really about how one person does her job. And the number of people who filtered in, you know, whenever you're doing a documentary, it's very much like who walks into your film, who do you run into on the street, who was going to come into the shop that day. And to discover that the number of people coming in all had relationships with this person that I was making a film about, right down to the cat. I mean, there was something from everyone, and it was very clear that the film that I had, which was, I think, the film I wanted to make all along, was what does this person mean to this neighborhood, and what does this neighborhood mean to this person who's running a shop that's not going to last forever? Or if it lasts forever, it will change, just like the neighborhood around it. So I think that was the biggest satisfaction of realizing the film I went in to make versus the film that I made, that I really wanted to make.
Sounds great. I think we're at time, sadly, because I could talk about these films for another hour. But I think we are at time. Thank you guys so much, all of you, for being here and for participating in the festival. Hopefully we'll see you in real life at some point in time. And yeah, thank you guys so much for making these films and for bringing these issues to light. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.